I want to show you an article from a magazine my son has. Look how much is on this page. Look at all of this. We have columns of main texts. There's a map on the next page. There's a vocabulary box. Plus, look at all those illustrations. That's a ton on the page, isn't it? To really understand this article, we need to carefully consider every single part of the article, asking how all the parts fit together. One of the things that makes this article so tricky is its structure, right? Well, here's the point I want to make. When you look at a text like this, with text boxes and maps and charts and all of that, it's really clear that reading involves building a coherent meaning out of all these pieces of text. But there are other texts that don't have so many obvious parts, but which actually are written in similar ways, just without all the boxes that make the parts so obvious. I think it's a good idea for us to figure out how to read text that looks like this, and also texts that maybe don't look like this, but which actually have a very similar complex structure. Structure is a word that means building. It's about how texts are built. And just like you can connect and build a single row of Legos, or a part of a Lego building, or an entire Lego building, the same is true of texts. As our texts get more complex, we have to study and consider the structure of those texts, noticing the overall structure and how chunks of text are built. Text structure is what we talked about in our small groups during focus. Compare and contrast, chronological, description. You remember those, right? Okay. Let's talk about the structure of a pretty complex text, our mentor text, When Lunch Fights Back. In Chapter 8, called Meet My Bodyguard, one thing we noticed is that each chapter goes a predictable way, and that the structure kind of repeats. It's kind of interesting because it's a hybrid made up of two different parts. The first part teaches us about a different kind of animal defense and sort of tells us the story of the animal. But then the second part is a little trickier to describe. So let's take a look at the science behind the story, and we can think about how this chunk is structured. Plants can't hide from predators. They can't fly or run away. Even so, plants are far from defenseless. Black mustard plants produce substances that make their leaves taste bad to most plant eaters. But cabbage white caterpillars actually like the taste of mustard seeds. So, when cabbage white butterflies mount and lay egg-laying attacks, mustard plants fight back by getting wasps to defend them. Sometimes this section kind of sounds like a report, like it did here, but not always. Sometimes it feels a bit like a story with the scientist as a character. It can look like at first glance that When Lunch Fights Back just has these big overall text structures. There aren't all those captions and headings and diagrams and illustrations that let us know the section is made up of a ton of parts, but these texts are still made up of a ton of parts, even if we don't see them quite so obviously. It's like our subtopic here, about how scientists study black mustard plants, is going to contain a lot of parts. These similar parts might contain different text structures, and the author would include signals that help us identify the structure of a chunk. Okay, so here's our anchor chart then with a new addition. There are many complex and hybrid structures. And we've got a chart here that will help us remember common structures in texts and transition words that signal each text structure. By the way, this chart shows up in your journal today, but it's blank. I wonder if I'm going to require that you fill it in. And if that wasn't bad enough, that one text has several structures. The book usually breaks into subtopics, and each of those can have multiple text structures. All right, let's take a look at When Lunch Fights Back again, Chapter 8. We're going to go through this and find changes in text structure. This first paragraph looks like it could be two different structures. It starts out with a problem-solution structure. I'm talking about how plants can't hide from predators, which is a problem, but they produce special substances, which is the solution. And then there's a paragraph that switches to a cause and effect when it says that cabbage white butterflies attack, which is a cause. The mustard plants use wasps to help them. That's the effect. Then the next 2.5 paragraphs are chronological. See how it's naming off things that Nina Fatoris did in her experiments, and it's naming them off in order. Now the book goes back to cause and effect, with the 5th paragraph explaining that the wasps lay eggs, the cause, that kill the butterfly eggs, the effect, Then that last paragraph pulls a quick compare and contrast when it looks at nature's strategies versus video games. This is a lot. Very complex, huh? Well, I'm not going to ask you to go through your book and make all those markings and sectioning off that I did, but I do want you to look at some of the times your book changes structure. So after your 20 minutes of reading, I want you to find 3 examples of when your book's structure changed and how you knew that. You might want to tell me when you saw some of those key transition words from our chart. Those would be easy ways to notice the structure changes. Okay, see you tomorrow.